August 25, 1944, northern France. The roads east of Saint-Lô were dust, diesel, and thunder. Convoys stretched as far as the eye could see, mile after mile of olive-drab trucks grinding through heat and exhaustion. The countryside still smelled of cordite and burnt wheat from the retreating Germans, but now another scent dominated: hot oil and gasoline. The wind carried it over the hedgerows and bomb-cratered fields, mixing with the metallic tang of spilled fuel and the faint sweetness of crushed apples from the orchards. War had turned the landscape into a furnace of motion. Sergeant William "Red" Callahan leaned against the fender of his GMC 2.5-ton truck, wiping grime from his face with a rag that had once been white. He'd been on the road for 72 hours straight, eyes red, hands blistered, uniforms soaked in sweat. The roar of engines had become his heartbeat, the vibrations of the road his only rhythm. Around him, men leaned against their trucks, smoked, joked without laughter, or simply stared into the distance. "We're the Red Ball Express," Red muttered, his voice dry and cracked. "They said we'd save Patton's tanks. Feels like we're holding up the whole damn war." The road shimmered in the heat. Dust rose like smoke behind every moving truck, turning the air into a haze of brown light. A column of vehicles rolled past, their sides marked with red circles, the Red Ball insignia painted hastily in army depots back in Normandy. From the ridgelines above, it looked like an iron river cutting through the heart of France, pouring east toward the front. On a hill above the road, 2 German prisoners sat inside a rough cage made of barbed wire and fence posts. Their uniforms were torn and sun-faded, their faces pale and hungry. One, a young Wehrmacht corporal named Dieter Kessler, squinted at the endless stream of trucks rumbling below. He shaded his eyes with a trembling hand, watching as the lines stretched to the horizon and disappeared into the heat shimmer. His lips curled into a thin smile. "They think trucks will win them a war," he said in German to the man beside him. "A few tires and gasoline, and they imagine themselves unstoppable." The older man, Hauptmann Werner Stahl, once a logistics officer under Rommel in North Africa, did not answer immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, watching the shimmering movement of engines, hearing the growl of thousands of pistons and gears. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Laugh all you want, Dieter," he said. "But this is no joke." Down below, Red climbed back into his truck as the whistle blew for the next departure. He checked his map, marked with red arrows that led from the beaches of Normandy to Chartres, Dreux, and eventually to Patton's spearhead near Paris. The map was worn soft from sweat and folding. He didn't know who had drawn those routes, but to him, they looked like veins, carrying the lifeblood of the war eastward. The convoy started moving again, each truck spaced at exact intervals, headlights hooded to hide their glow from the air. A mechanical symphony rose, engines coughing, gears grinding, horns honking once in salute as they rolled out. The soldiers called it the Dance of Steel. From the ridge, Dieter watched as night began to fall. The last light of the setting sun turned the trucks into silhouettes, each one a dark shadow crawling forward. He felt the vibration through the ground even from 100 meters away. The noise was unbroken, like thunder that never stopped rolling. He thought of the German supply lines he had once known, horse-drawn wagons, gasoline shortages, trucks that had to be stripped for parts when the retreat began. He thought of the bombed-out railways, the bridges lying in rivers. And now he saw the Americans moving as if nothing could stop them. When darkness settled fully, the convoy's lights vanished under blackout covers, but the sound continued. It was eerie, an invisible force rolling through the night. Somewhere down the valley, a lone truck backfired, and the echo bounced across the hills like a gunshot. The prisoners were moved that night to a supply depot near Avranches, transported in a canvas-covered truck that smelled of diesel and rubber. When they arrived, Dieter was struck silent. The depot stretched across an entire field, hundreds of trucks idling, their engines humming in unison. Soldiers in greasy uniforms loaded crates, stacked fuel drums, and passed out rations. The floodlights glowed dim under blackout covers, casting a yellow halo over everything. He saw men laughing despite their fatigue, white soldiers, black soldiers, officers shouting orders, drivers swapping cans of coffee and candy bars like old friends. A painted sign stood by the gate, "Red Ball Route, keep 'em rolling." Dieter couldn't look away. He'd been trained to see war as precision and discipline, a matter of strategy and maps. But this was chaos turned into order, power born from movement. He didn't understand it yet. Not the obsession, not the machinery, not the endless motion behind it. But he would. The trucks roared through his dreams that night, and even when the engine stopped, the echo stayed, low, relentless, like the heartbeat of an army that refused to rest. Before his capture, Dieter Kessler had served with the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. He was 21 years old, raised in Munich on discipline and devotion to the Reich. His instructors had taught him that Germany's strength lay in precision, in order, mathematics, and calculation. Every bullet counted, every gallon of fuel recorded. Efficiency was sacred. The enemy, they said, was careless, driven by abundance, not intellect. The Americans, above all, were mocked as amateurs, men who used machines to replace courage, who fought like factory workers. His lieutenant, a bitter man from Essen, used to sneer, "They win by wasting. Their trucks leak oil and their soldiers leak fear." In the chaos after the Falaise pocket, Dieter had watched those same inefficient Americans advance like a machine with no face and no fatigue. His unit supply trucks had been destroyed by airstrikes, fuel rationed to a few liters a day. They had dragged their panzers with horses before surrendering. On August 22, 1944, outside Mortain, Dieter had dropped his rifle, hands trembling as P-47 Thunderbolts shrieked overhead. He'd been captured beside a burned half-track, staring at the charred remains of the same German efficiency he once worshipped. Now, as a prisoner of war riding north through liberated France, Dieter saw the opposite kind of order. The American convoys never ended. Bulldozers roared where artillery had once thundered. Engineers in grease-stained uniforms shouted over clanging steel as they repaired bridges and carved roads through wreckage. The smell of gasoline followed them everywhere, an invisible empire of movement. At night, sparks from welding torches lit the horizon like fireflies. He pressed his face against the truck's wooden slats as they passed an airfield. Dozens of aircraft sat in perfect rows, men loading drums of fuel beneath the wings. The rhythm of their work was astonishing. There was no shouting, no punishment, only motion. Every man seemed to know his part without needing orders. It was a choreography of purpose. "You Americans," Dieter said once to a guard who rode on the tailgate, "you make war like an assembly line." The guard laughed, a tall black sergeant from Louisiana named Henry Jacobs. His helmet was tilted back, cigarette hanging loose from his lips. "Damn right, Fritz," he said, exhaling smoke. "And we don't take weekends off." The words struck Dieter harder than he expected. He turned them over for days as their truck bounced along the dusty roads of Normandy. He had never met a man like Jacobs before, relaxed yet unbreakable, amused by war but not consumed by it. There was no hatred in him, only a kind of steady pride that seemed to come from something deeper than uniform or flag. At the next stop, Dieter began to study everything. The Americans' discipline hid beneath their easy talk, masked by jokes and songs. When they unloaded supplies, they moved like clockwork. When a truck broke down, 3 men appeared with wrenches before it even stopped rolling. He saw trucks marked with red circles, the insignia of the Red Ball Express, carrying rations, ammunition, and fuel for Patton's Third Army. The convoys ran day and night, engines never cooling, from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines near Metz. He counted the trucks one afternoon and stopped at 100 before he lost sight of the line. Each driver hauled up to 10 tons of supplies, averaging 60 gallons of fuel per tank, 3 tanks per trip, sometimes more. They drove 400-mile round trips through wrecked villages, cratered bridges, and rain-soaked roads that swallowed tires whole. Many of them were barely soldiers, farmers from Iowa, mechanics from Chicago, bus drivers from Detroit. Yet they kept going, singing through the static of the radio, mud streaked on their faces, letters from home folded in their breast pockets. More than once, Dieter saw trucks limping in with bullet holes through their windshields. Ambushes were common along the wooded stretches near Dreux. Bridges collapsed from overuse. But every time one truck fell, another appeared to take its place. One evening, while the prisoners were lined up for food, Dieter heard a young American corporal talking to a comrade. "I ain't slept in 2 days," the man said, yawning. "But as long as them tanks keep drinkin', I'll keep drivin'." Dieter's stomach turned with something that wasn't quite envy nor admiration, but confusion. He had been raised to believe that victory came from ideology, from the purity of belief and discipline. But here, victory came from will, from motion, from men who refused to stop even when every bone in their body begged them to. At the depot near Chartres, Dieter managed to keep a small notebook hidden beneath his shirt, a scrap of paper and pencil stub taken from a wrecked farmhouse. He began writing down what he saw. The entries were short at first. Numbers, sketches of trucks, the names of towns. Then words began to fill the pages. They drive like men possessed. Not by ideology, but by purpose. He wrote it in German first, then slowly translated it into English, testing each word on his tongue. Purpose. It was a strange word, neither military nor ideological. It was something he had never felt in the Reich. Days turned into weeks, and still the convoys rolled. Sometimes the sound of engines drowned out his sleep. He could close his eyes and still see the rhythmic sway of the trucks, their canvas flapping like sails in a wind that never ceased. He began to understand that what he was witnessing wasn't chaos at all. It was organized humanity, thousands of individuals united not by fear or command, but by duty to one another. One night, as the sky burned orange from distant artillery, Dieter sat behind the wire fence, the notebook open on his knees. The engines in the valley below purred endlessly. He pressed his pencil to the page again and wrote, "The Americans do not fight for conquest. They fight to keep moving. Perhaps that is why they cannot be stopped." The sentence startled him. It felt like betrayal, but also truth. He tore the page out, folded it carefully, and hid it in his boot. When the guards came by with flashlights, he pretended to sleep. Outside, the convoys rolled on. The dust never settled. The Red Ball Express roared like an endless heartbeat in the night, and for the first time in his young life, Dieter Kessler began to doubt everything he had ever been taught about war, order, and strength. Late September 1944. The rains had come early to northern France, turning roads into rivers of mud and filling the night air with the smell of wet gasoline and clay. The Red Ball Express, once just a rumor among German soldiers, had grown into something that defied imagination. Over 6,000 vehicles on the move each day, 23,000 drivers, 12,000 tons of supplies delivered daily. It wasn't an army anymore. It was a phenomenon. Dieter Kessler, now a prisoner of war assigned as a translator at a captured U.S. supply depot near Chartres, spent his days surrounded by the roar of engines and the rattle of fuel drums. The depot stretched across what had once been farmland, a sea of mud dotted with mountains of crates, coiled cables, and stacks of ammunition boxes. Trucks came and went every hour, headlights dimmed, tarps dripping rainwater. The Americans called it organized chaos, and somehow, it worked. His task was simple: translate French repair orders, tally shipments, and help engineers communicate with local civilians. But Dieter's real fascination lay in the rhythm of it all. He had seen German logistics collapse under Allied bombing, bridges destroyed, depots abandoned, fuel convoys swallowed by retreat. Yet here, the Americans seemed unstoppable. When one road washed out, they built another. When a truck broke down, it was stripped, fixed, or replaced in minutes. The first time he saw a repair crew at work, he thought it was theater. A GMC CCKW truck rolled in with a shattered axle, the driver shouting over the noise of rain. Within seconds, 3 mechanics slid beneath it with jacks, wrenches, and a spare part already waiting. Sparks flew from the welder's torch, the air smelled of burnt oil, and by the time Dieter looked up from his clipboard, the truck was rumbling away again. 10 minutes. No shouting, no panic. Just efficiency. Captain Louise Miller, the depot's commander, noticed Dieter watching. She was a sharp-eyed woman from Kansas, her sleeves rolled up, a pencil tucked behind one ear. "Each truck's a cog in a system, son," she said, gesturing toward the yard where another convoy was lining up. We got traffic MPs clearing junctions, engineers laying culverts, and a maintenance crew every 50 miles. The trucks don't stop. The line doesn't stop. America doesn't stop. Her words hung in the air. Dieter turned toward the map pinned to the wall, a vast web of red lines stretching from the Normandy beaches to Paris, then east toward the Meuse and Moselle rivers. Cherbourg, Le Havre, Chartres, Reims. Forward depots feeding Patton's tanks at the front. The whole continent seemed wired together through roads, bridges, and fuel lines. He had never seen war represented this way, not as territory, but as energy. He began studying the Americans' methods with quiet obsession. He watched how convoys assembled like clockwork, how each truck carried not only cargo but spare tires, extra belts, and jerrycans strapped tight to its sides. The men worked in shifts, each knowing his route by heart. Radios crackled with coded instructions: Red Ball 12 clear at junction, Convoy 9 rolling east, bridge bypass at Dreux operational. It was a language of movement, more precise than orders shouted on a battlefield. Even the breakdowns seemed rehearsed. Mobile shops rolled in, converted trucks carrying compressors, welding kits, and racks of tools. Mechanics crawled over engines by lantern light while drivers brewed coffee nearby. No one complained. No one stopped. The Red Ball Express had its own gravity, pulling every man into its rhythm. When a thunderstorm hit that week, the roads turned treacherous. Mud swallowed tires, and the wind howled across the fields. Trucks slid into ditches, headlights smeared with grime. But still they moved. Crews worked waist-deep in muck, laying down crushed stone, hauling stranded vehicles out with winches and tow cables. The rain pounded for 20 hours straight. By dawn, the convoys were rolling again. Dieter watched as the men of the 514th Quartermaster Truck Regiment, mostly black drivers from the American South, kept the lifeline alive through the worst of it. They worked soaked to the bone, sleeves rolled up, boots caked in mud. Their laughter carried through the storm, and at night they sang low, rolling blues songs that rose above the engine noise. "You boys don't rest?" Dieter asked one night, translating for a corporal who had twisted his ankle trying to push a stuck truck free. The man grinned through exhaustion, teeth flashing white against the grease and mud on his face. "Rest?" he said, chuckling. "Not till Berlin." The words hit Dieter like a prophecy. Not till Berlin. To him, Berlin had always been the immovable heart of the Reich, unreachable, unbreakable. Yet these men, soaked and shivering in a French mud field, spoke of reaching it as casually as a farmer speaks of the next sunrise. It wasn't arrogance. It was certainty. That night, he couldn't sleep. Rain drummed against the tin roof of the depot as the engines outside idled, their low growl merging into a constant hum. He thought of his homeland, of officers demanding perfection, of soldiers whipped for lateness, of engineers who had been executed for inefficiency. And he thought of these Americans, who seemed to build perfection out of imperfection, patching roads, welding bridges, singing through fatigue. In the morning he watched a convoy depart. The drivers climbed into their seats one by one, faces still streaked with mud. The engines started in unison, headlights flaring through the mist. He counted 40 trucks before the last one passed, the red circle painted on each door gleaming wet in the early light. For the first time, Dieter understood what he was witnessing. It wasn't just logistics. It was momentum made flesh, the power of a nation that believed more in persistence than in precision. Germany had built machines to conquer, but America had built a machine that could not stop. When Captain Miller passed by, Dieter spoke quietly, almost to himself. "You've made war into an industry." She smiled faintly, pulling her raincoat tighter. "Not an industry, son. A promise." The sound of the departing convoy echoed through the valley, a mechanical heartbeat fading into distance. Dieter stood there long after it disappeared, his clipboard forgotten, the rain dripping from his cap. The mud, the smoke, the endless motion, it all blurred into a single thought that stayed with him for the rest of the war. This is what defeat sounds like, not a battle lost, but a machine that never runs out of fuel. The morning was colder than any Dieter could remember since his capture. A gray mist hung low over the depot, swallowing the sound of distant engines. The air smelled of wet earth, diesel, and smoke from the oil drums burning at the edge of camp. The men moved slower that morning, exhausted from the storm, the endless nights, the mechanical rhythm that never stopped. The Red Ball Express had been running for more than a month without pause. Even the mud seemed tired. Just before dawn, a battered convoy rolled in from the east. The trucks looked like survivors of a storm, windshields cracked, canvas torn, mud plastered to the sides like armor. Their engines coughed and wheezed, headlights dim under layers of grime. Dieter stood by the loading bay, clipboard in hand, when one of the drivers stumbled out of his cab. His uniform was ripped, his hands bleeding through torn gloves, his face black with oil. The name stitched to his jacket stopped Dieter cold. Jacobs. Henry Jacobs, the same man who had once guarded him weeks ago on that endless drive through Normandy. The same man who had laughed and said, "We don't take weekends off." Jacobs was limping, his left sleeve soaked dark with blood. He clutched his arm just below the shoulder, where a jagged piece of shrapnel had torn through the fabric. The medics called out, but he waved them off with a lopsided grin. "Ain't nothin'," he muttered. "Just a love bite from Jerry." He staggered toward a fuel truck, one arm useless, the other dragging a jerrycan of gasoline across the mud. The can must have weighed 40 pounds, but he refused to let go. "Can't stop now," he said to no one in particular. "Gasoline's the blood. Tanks go dry, boys die." Dieter watched him for a moment, heart pounding with something strange. Not pity, not guilt, but a deep recognition. The war that had taught him to divide the world into enemies and allies suddenly felt very far away. Jacobs was trembling, trying to lift the can, the muscles in his good arm shaking from exhaustion. Without thinking, Dieter stepped forward. He moved past the guards, who hesitated but didn't stop him. He reached out, grasped the other handle of the jerrycan, and together they lifted it. Jacobs glanced sideways, sweat cutting pale lines through the grime on his face. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize him. Then his lips twitched. "Well, I'll be damned," Jacobs said softly. "Fritz with a helping hand." They carried the can together to the waiting truck, boots squelching in the mud. The driver leaned out of the cab and nodded in thanks, too tired to speak. When the last drop of gasoline splashed into the tank, Jacobs leaned on the fender, breathing hard. Dieter stood beside him, both men silent, steam rising from their shoulders in the chill air. For the first time since the war began, Dieter felt no sides. No uniforms. Just exhaustion and understanding. Two men standing in the same mud, serving the same endless machine. As the horizon began to pale, they sat down on a crate near the depot fire. The flames hissed as raindrops hit the oil-drenched wood, and the sky slowly turned from black to dull silver. Dieter tore a piece of the coarse prison bread he'd saved from the night before and offered it. Jacobs hesitated, then took it, chewing slowly, eyes half closed from fatigue. For a while, neither spoke. The world around them hummed, engines idling, mechanics cursing softly, trucks rolling out one by one. Somewhere, a radio crackled faintly with a tune that didn't belong to war. "You still think we can't win with trucks?" Jacobs asked quietly after a long silence. His voice was low, almost tired of its own confidence. Dieter looked toward the eastern road, where a new convoy was forming, headlights winking through the mist, red circles gleaming faintly on every door. The line stretched toward the horizon, toward battles he'd never see, toward a future he couldn't imagine. He smiled faintly, the expression strange on his face after so many years of hardness. "No," he said softly. "Now I understand. You already have." Jacobs chuckled under his breath. "Didn't take Berlin yet, partner." "You will," Dieter replied. "You've already built the road there." Jacobs leaned back, his injured arm tucked close. "Funny, ain't it? You fought for an idea. We're just fightin' to keep the wheels turnin'. Guess that's what wins wars, keepin'." The words sank deep. Dieter realized then that ideology had built walls, but motion, simple, stubborn motion, tore them down. The Americans didn't move because they hated. They moved because they had to, because something in them refused to stop. When the medics came back around, Jacobs finally let them patch him up. He winced but didn't complain. Before he was taken to the infirmary, he looked back at Dieter and lifted his good hand in a tired salute. Dieter nodded in return, unsure if prisoners were even allowed to salute, but he did it anyway. The next day, Jacobs was gone, transferred to another route, another convoy. The depot went back to its rhythm, the grind of engines, the rumble of trucks, the hiss of rain. But for Dieter, something fundamental had shifted. He found himself working harder, translating faster, anticipating orders before they were given. When a driver dropped a wrench, he picked it up. When a mechanic needed an extra hand, he offered one. No one ordered him to. It simply felt natural. One night, weeks later, as the Red Ball trucks rolled out under a moonless sky, Dieter stood by the fence and watched the procession fade into the distance. He thought of Jacobs, his grin, his bloodied sleeve, his words echoing through the hum of engines. Asterisk gasoline's the blood. Tanks go dry, boys die, asterisk. He whispered the line to himself like a prayer. And for the first time since the world had gone mad, Dieter didn't feel like a prisoner. He felt like a man watching the pulse of humanity, flawed, stubborn, unrelenting, keeping the world alive, one truck at a time. Weeks later, word reached even the farthest depots. Paris had been liberated. The bells of the city had rung again for the first time in 4 years, and for the men of the Red Ball Express, the victory came not with parades but with more orders, more miles to drive, more fuel to haul. The roads east of Chartres turned slick with autumn rain, but the convoys didn't stop. They never did. By October, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 100 million gallons of fuel in just 81 days. It was an achievement no one had thought possible, a feat of motion that defied the chaos of war. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Dieter's time among them ended. The POW trucks came one gray morning, and the prisoners were loaded up, bound for the coast. From there, they would be shipped to England, far from the front lines. The journey north was quiet. The guns of France faded into memory, replaced by the steady drone of the transport engine. Dieter sat pressed against the cold metal wall of the truck, watching the French countryside roll by through slats in the wood. The hedgerows were turning yellow now, autumn claiming what war had spared. He watched a convoy pass on the opposite road, trucks still bearing the red circle insignia, splashing through puddles, their wheels spitting mud. For a moment, he thought he could smell the fuel again, taste the dust in his mouth. At night, in the hold of the ship crossing the channel, he lay awake listening to the creak of steel and the low hum of the engines. It was a softer rhythm than the Red Ball convoys, but it carried the same pulse, steady, unbroken. It reminded him of Jacobs, of the way he had grinned through pain and said, "Gasoline's the blood." Those words had lodged themselves deep in Dieter's mind, and he could not shake them loose. The POW camp in England was cleaner, colder, more disciplined than the depots in France. Rows of wooden huts lined a muddy field ringed with barbed wire. The guards were polite but firm, their English clipped and precise. Every day had its order: breakfast, roll call, labor detail, lights out. But for Dieter, the rhythm of the trucks lingered. He began sketching in the margins of old paper scraps, engines, gearboxes, axles, transmission lines, maps of supply routes he remembered from the wall in Captain Miller's office. His bunkmates thought he was mad. "You draw the things that defeated us," one said bitterly. Dieter only shook his head. "No," he replied softly. "I draw what survived us." In his letters home to his mother in Munich, he did not write of defeat or humiliation. He wrote of motion, of the sound of engines echoing through the fog, of headlights cutting paths through the night, of men who worked not for ideology but for momentum itself. He described the Red Ball Express as if it were alive, a living artery that carried the pulse of a nation. "They move as if rest were a kind of death," he wrote. As if to stop would mean surrendering the very thing that makes them human. The British censors read every letter, of course, but they let his pass. Perhaps they, too, sensed there was no danger in his words, only awe. Some nights, Dieter woke in the darkness, certain he could hear the distant blare of a truck horn. He would sit up, breath caught in his throat, eyes fixed on the ceiling until the sound faded. It was never there, not really, just memory. Yet to him, It was more real than the silence around him. The Red Ball convoys had left a ghost behind, a kind of mechanical heartbeat that refused to die. He started building small models from scrap, toy-sized engines made from tin, wire, and bits of broken tools. The guards found them odd but harmless. "Keeps him busy," one of them joked. But for Dieter, each model was a study, an attempt to understand. He realized that Germany had built machines to conquer, sleek, precise, efficient, but also fragile, dependent on perfection. When the smallest part broke, the whole system failed. The Americans had built something messier, heavier, but enduring. Their strength wasn't in design, it was in resilience. Every piece of machinery he drew carried the same truth. Endurance was a kind of faith. It didn't demand purity or victory, only persistence. The Americans had mastered that faith, the belief that if the wheels kept turning, the world could be rebuilt, mile by mile. As winter crept into the camp, frost forming on the inside of the windows, Dieter would sit on his bunk, staring at his sketches by the dim yellow light. The sound of the wind against the walls would merge with the hum of the trucks in his mind. The war felt far away now, yet the rhythm of that endless convoy still lived inside him. He didn't know if Germany would ever rise again, or what his own life would become when the fences were gone. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty, that the world belonged not to those who sought perfection, but to those who kept moving forward, no matter how broken, no matter how tired. And sometimes, when the guards switched off the lights and silence settled over the camp, Dieter could still see them, phantom headlights cutting through the English fog, the sound of engines in the distance, the heartbeat of a machine that had taught him what endurance truly meant.